Thank you for a very kind introduction. Good morning to everybody. And I'm happy to be here. This is the first time I've been to the University of Dayton and the second time in my life that I've been to Dayton. So this is some importance, I guess, or significance to me, having grown up in the East Coast, which for whom, as some of you know, anything west of the Appalachians is somehow west. So Dayton was one of those cities, along with Cleveland and Cincinnati and so on, that were storied in the imagination, but that I had never seen as a kid. So I'm happy to actually be able to see it. What I've been asked to do this morning is a very pleasant task in some ways for an author, which is to be very blunt about it, to promote the virtues of a recent book, of which I'm a co-author. But to do that in the larger context of the purposes, as I understand it at least, of this conference. So what I'm going to do really is to spend part of my time talking about the findings from this study, which was a study that I carried out along with two colleagues, Ann Colby and Thomas Ehrlich, at the the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, a study that culminated in a book which was published last year with the rather long and forbidding title, Rethinking Business Education, Undergraduate Business Education, Liberal Learning for the Profession. And I suspect that it was that subtitle that caught the attention of the organizers of this conference, thinking that we might have something new and important to say about business as a profession. Whether we do, you'll be able to judge as I go along. So as I said, I want to spend some time talking about that and focusing in particular on a set of ideas that we developed through the study that appears essentially in the book that we refer to as key modes of thinking. And as I'll be explaining a bit later, that there are three of those plus one. This was really devised thinking that people can usually hold three things in their mind at once. It's a little harder when you get to 4 and 5. So it might work to call them 3 and 1. What they are, I'll be explaining in just a couple of minutes. And then to turn from that to, I think, a more particular topic, which is one of the ways in which that idea of more liberal learning for business undergraduates can be carried out. And there I'll be drawing both from some actual cases that we develop in the book, as well as a somewhat more speculative development of these into what I'm going to call the social ecology of business as a threshold concept. And if the idea of threshold concept isn't immediately familiar, don't worry, I will spend a bit of pedantic time explaining what that is a little bit further along. So let me begin by saying that I'm grateful to the organizers of the conference and to the International Conference on Catholic Social Thought and Management Education, as well as to the University of Dayton, for the opportunity to present some of the findings and ideas of the study, which I've just referred to. The study appeared in 2011, so what I'll be saying this morning mostly comes from that, but is already beginning to be changed and modified as we've been receiving responses to the work. To begin, I can provide some good news and then some not so good news. The good news is that the issue of business as a profession is becoming one of serious interest in many quarters of business education. Many of you are probably familiar with the Harvard Business School's effort to bring ideas of professionalism centrally into their master's program. It's noteworthy, I think, that the Wharton School and a number of other leading institutions have begun serious revisions of their curricula and approaches at the MBA level, spurred in part by their implication in the disaster of the Great Recession, in which the world remains mired. Our study, however, was a business at the undergraduate level, where it is the largest of college majors in the United States. It's over 21% of all undergraduates as of 2007, and it has begun to become popular in Europe and Asia as well. And it's worth, I think, thinking for a moment what that statistic of 21-point-something% really means. It means that if the University of Dayton were a statistically accurate representation of American higher education, every fifth student, almost every fourth student that you would meet on campus would be a business major. So it's a very large number of undergraduates. Now, the less than good news is that after a century of business education in the university, the field is still not seen, nor does it function much like a profession such as law or medicine. Throughout the past century, business schools and programs were often controversial in higher education precisely because businesses and business personnel were so often seen not as professional in their approach. The efforts to professionalize business management that began in the early 20th century sought to emphasize the role of business enterprise as providing social benefits in the form of valued products and services. However, as Rakesh Khurana's History of Business Education has shown, this professionalization project, as he calls it, was undermined in the second half of the century by the importation of market-centered theories of management derived from academic economics. From the 1970s onward to the present, the new business disciplines intended, and I think this is important to grasp, intended to give greater intellectual heft to preparation for business, had the effect of teaching business students to see themselves as interest-maximizing experts who could make fortunes in finance and consulting rather than, as in the earlier professionalization project, managers responsible for using their expertise to enhance public prosperity. The result has been a lack of agreement within business schools and in the larger society about the underlying purposes and moral dimensions of business itself. Without such a sense of social purpose, however, a profession cannot fully develop or function. In this situation, the resources of the tradition of Catholic social teaching are valuable not to settle the issue, but to provide alternatives to the kind of market absolutism that has become so powerful a force in precluding serious discussion of these issues. With its emphasis upon the social nature of humanity, the dignity of the human person, and an ethics of the common good, along with its preferential option for the poor, this tradition and the classical and biblical sources from which it draws are important for fostering a wider imaginative vision of what a career in business might be about. In what follows, I will present ideas from Rethinking Undergraduate Business Education, as well as other work I've done in directing the preparation for the Professions program at the Carnegie Foundation over the past decade. That program studied preparation for 5 professional fields: for law, engineering, the Jewish and Christian clergy, nursing, and medicine. My aim will be to make an argument about the nature and potential of professional education at an undergraduate level, and then to show the key role liberal education can play in such education. I will follow this by an example, the case of Steve Jobs and Apple Computers, to show the need for this kind of blending of liberal and professional education in order to prepare students for productive careers in business. Then finally, I will conclude by proposing a new agenda for investigation and experiment to realize a better form of undergraduate business education, an agenda to which I believe the tradition of Catholic social teaching can make a signal contribution. So first, educating for a profession. It means, I think, forming the practical imagination. Higher education shapes the practical imagination. Among the several dimensions of personal identity, it is the practical imagination that proposes what we can make of our lives and the things we may hope for individually and together. The scope of the practical imagination either expands or contracts students' capacities to engage with their lives in resourceful, reflective ways. So that in today's colleges, educating the practical imagination toward broad ends is an intensely collaborative affair. It must include the willing participation of students themselves, as well as the faculty, and in fact, all university personnel. With a great majority of today's students educated in professional or pre-professional courses of study, higher education's effects on the practical imagination of this generation of students will be especially concentrated on vocational questions and themes. Professional education presents students with the knowledge, skills, and purpose of the field they seek to learn. And this is something that we saw in the Carnegie Foundation studies over and over again, that these 5 very different fields that we studied all had that in common, that whatever else they did, they really were focused on providing students with very specific bodies of knowledge, specific kinds of cognitive and practical skills, as well as the most difficult thing of all, conveying a sense of the purpose and meaning of work in that field. So professional education then frames how students relate the demands and possibilities of the profession to their developing sense of self and purpose. It's very much then a developmental process for undergraduates in particular. So higher education has the responsibility, I want to argue, to see that its vocational programs do justice to the large task of preparing students to shape lives of meaning and purpose. Within a dynamic but unstable world, the Academy needs to provide a professional preparation that is broad as well as deep. So to get at this idea, one of the organizing metaphors of the Preparation for the Professions program was that of apprenticeship. Today's students, in effect, apprentice to their chosen professional fields through the professional school. Their first encounter with their professions typically takes place in the educational setting, and it is in that context that they begin to become professionals. All professional schools face the challenge of presenting 3 sets of values, or 3 apprenticeships. The first is an academic or cognitive training, and this is what the university, of course, specializes in, and what faculty typically feel most equipped to do and to provide. But they also must provide a second apprenticeship, which emphasizes the practical capabilities of actual practice of the field. Much harder for many faculty to provide. While the third apprenticeship is concerned with the formation of a professional identity that aligns with the profession's defining purposes and values. The 3 are often in tension with each other. They occupy different and unequal status in the curriculum and are often taught by different faculty. So imagining yourself in the position of a student, apprenticing to a field then is in itself a major task of figuring out the relative importance and value of these 3 rather distinct apprenticeships, which, as I said, often are taught by different faculty and are given very different weight in the curriculum. On the whole, what we discovered is that everywhere the academic apprenticeship gets first billing. That's what's assessed and tested most. That's what students typically receive most rewards for, and that's what faculty really like most. The second apprenticeship is often a sort of stepchild, frequently taught by adjunct faculty, sometimes graded pass-fail, not taken as seriously. And then finally, the third apprenticeship, the apprenticeship of identity and purpose, is very often a kind of afterthought. Therefore, the great challenge of professional education is to devise ways to bring students learning together, to integrate that learning in effective ways, in order to shape the kind of practical imagination that defines members of a specific profession. So within that context, then, what is the particular challenge of business as a field for professional education? Well, first, like all forms of professional preparation, business programs immerse students in the values and mindsets that are peculiar to the field. In business, this means, perhaps most prominently, the logic of the marketplace. This immersion holds the attendant danger that students will lose sight of the larger pluralism of institutional sectors and spheres of value within which business has to operate. This is not just a theoretical concern. Indeed, we found it distressingly common, even in high-quality undergraduate business programs that we visited, to hear students say that their business courses had taught them that, quote, everything is business, overlooking, we hope, their actual awareness of the different values represented by their families, religious congregations, and communities. Like all undergraduates, business students need the ability to grasp this pluralism in ways of thinking and acting that is so salient a characteristic of the contemporary world. And it is especially important that business students learn to recognize and distinguish between the dominant logic of business and the marketplace, on the one hand, and the other very different values and ways of acting that hold sway in the family and domestic sphere, the worlds of science and education, the arts, and democratic government. Business graduates will need facility in moving among these different spheres of value and logics of action. They will benefit from learning to see business and its logic from the outside as well as from within. The need, then, to grasp this pluralism of values and contexts is, we believe, the weak link in the current organization of undergraduate business programs. Most business programs require their students to take a substantial number of courses outside the business disciplines in classic arts and sciences fields such as English composition, literature, history, the social sciences, natural sciences, and mathematics. And typically in Catholic institutions, this is extended to include theology and philosophy. However, the relation of these studies to students' major courses in business is rarely well articulated or closely coordinated. The overall program as it stands now might be thought of as a curricular barbell. Each end of the bar carries a significant weight of intellectual subject matter, but the connection between them is slender. So a load of weights on one side that's called arts and sciences, distribution requirements, liberal arts, something like that, and then a much heavier, from the student's point of view, and more significant load of weights at the other end of the bar, which is called the business major. The linkages between the two ends of the barbell receive little explicit attention, either in the way the curriculum is organized or in how courses are taught. This arrangement, I want to submit, is not the best way to support the high-quality, interconnected learning that today's students need in order to understand the relation of business to the larger world. Indeed, I want to argue that shaping the practical imagination so as to be able to make sense of the world and of one's place in it is the actual purpose of liberal learning. It is really the purpose of undergraduate education as a whole. In recent decades, research on human learning has made it clear that effective learning depends significantly on learners' intentions and motivation. With business student interest focused on career preparation as the most important outcome of college, and the evidence on this is quite clear that that's what it is, the goals of liberal education are more achievable if they are explicitly related to students' existing horizon of interest, something that is often very repugnant to faculty in the arts and sciences. So liberal learning has, I think, the potential to broaden and reshape such initially narrow purposes. But for this to occur, students must come to see how and why the perspectives of the arts and sciences open up and provide insight into matters of concern to them. This requires a kind of teaching that systematically leads students to grasp and participate in making such connections. So now I'd like to turn briefly to some examples of promising programs that really do come close to meeting this challenge. And it's fortunate that in our study we were able to document a number of these. These are really models of curricula and teaching practices that hold potential for rethinking how undergraduate business programs are organized. The examples all shared an intentional effort, and that's important to see, that they were conceived and carried out very intentionally and consciously, an effort to connect business subjects with liberal arts perspectives. They were developed by very different institutions. One, by New York University's highly selective Stern School of Business. Another, the Arts and Sciences College of Indiana University. And the third, the revised core curriculum at Santa Clara University. So the Stern School of Business at NYU, with strong support from the dean and senior faculty, has adopted a required 4-year curricular sequence that addresses the formation of students' professional responsibility, character, and thoughtfulness about the place of business in the larger social contexts. So in their freshman year, all Stern students take a course called Business and Its Publics. In the sophomore year, a course called Organizational Communication and Its Social Context. As juniors, they study law, business, and society. And in their senior year, they take a capstone course entitled Professional Responsibility and Leadership. These courses are designed as a sequence. They build on one another. The overall term for this part of the curriculum is the social impact core, meaning the social impact of business. Indiana University's Liberal Arts and Management program, or LAMP, starts from the arts and sciences end to develop a rich context for thinking about the place of business in the larger social world and its history. LAMP starts each year with a new cohort of 100 honors students in the arts and sciences and provides them with strong business education, 6 business courses, including marketing, accounting, management, economics. And then in their freshman, junior, and senior years, LAMP students also take interdisciplinary seminars on topics such as the effects of particular technologies on society, or the ways in which the nature of work has changed, that connect business with its historical and societal settings. In yet another configuration, Santa Clara University has developed a new form of core curriculum, so really moving away from the barbell, that they require of all undergraduates, that they call pathways. These are sequences of 3 or 4 courses in a variety of disciplines that all articulate a common interdisciplinary theme. So examples of pathways are sustainability, democracy, leading people, justice and the arts, organizations, food, hunger, and poverty, and design, and there are others. Students taking pathway courses develop samples of their work, a portfolio of academic achievement that they then present as seniors in an extended reflective essay. The faculty involved in this refer to it as a double helix curriculum, in which at the same time that students are developing expertise in business, or whatever their other major might be, they're also paralleling this with this 3 or 4 course sequence that expands the scope in which they come to see their chosen major. So all 3 of these programs, as well as a number of others that we profile in Rethinking Undergraduate Business Education, embody several modes of thinking which we assert is necessary for liberal learning. This is education which aims to enable students to make sense of the world and their place in it, a very large order, which is really the key, I think, to lifelong learning, the motivation to do that. Make sense of the world and their place in it, preparing them to use knowledge and skills as means toward responsible engagement with the life of their times. In order to do this, we argue that learning must involve 3 modes of thinking plus 1. So to put it schematically, the 3 modes of thinking are, first, analytical thinking. Analytical thinking abstracts from particular experience in order to produce formal knowledge that is general in nature and independent of any particular context. This is really the common coin of higher education. It's what is common to every course in a college or university. It's something that faculty spend most of their time and effort attempting to promote and to get students to understand and develop facility with. Analytical thinking is in some cases quantitative or using mathematical, logical symbolism. Much of it is verbal in the symbolism involved, but in every case, it is marked by being methodical and consistent, something that students often have a lot of difficulty grasping and making their own. It begins from a particular set of assumptions or categories and proceeds to develop the implications of these concepts through deduction. So this is what students usually begin to encounter in high school in the classic form of Euclid's Elements of Geometry. But analytical thinking is simply the baseline, as it were. The second mode of thought is what we call multiple framing. This is the ability to work intellectually with fundamentally different analytical schemes. And these are schemes that sometimes are mutually incompatible. So think of the way in which, let us say, economists talk about education compared to the way in which sociologists or anthropologists or ethicists may approach the same phenomena. These schemes are not wholly compatible. And as we know, the lay public in general has great difficulty making sense of this when they encounter experts speaking from these different analytical perspectives, and so do most undergraduates. So we argue that one of the keys to college education is developing capacity and facility with this ability. And this is really the practical meaning of the holding contradictory ideas together at one time. So this involves conscious awareness, then, that any particular scheme of analytical thinking, that is, any intellectual discipline, frames experience in particular ways. It has a viewpoint. The third mode of thinking we call the reflective exploration of meaning. The reflective exploration of meaning encompasses the most self-reflective aspects of learning. It involves the exploration of meaning, value, and commitment. So its questions are different from those typically raised in purely analytical or indeed multiple framing kind of thinking. It asks questions such as, what difference does a particular understanding, a particular framing or approach to things make to who I am, to how I engage the world, and what it's reasonable for me to imagine and hope. This connects very directly then to what I began with, the expansion of the practical imagination, or the deepening of the practical imagination. And this is the traditional heart of liberal education, of the Studia Humanitatis in particular, and it is crucial, we argue, for any and all forms of college education. So that's the three. The fourth, which we discovered to be more prominent in professional programs than in liberal arts programs and departments typically, we call practical reasoning. Practical reasoning represents the capacity to draw on knowledge and intellectual skills to engage concretely with the world. Practical reasoning allows the individual to go beyond reflection to deliberate and decide upon the best course of action within a particular situation. Such thinking is characteristic of professional judgment, including the judgment of business leaders, as well as being a key capacity of statesmen and of engaged citizens. So this, we think, is a broad and fundamental capacity that higher education needs to be teaching much more and much more effectively. It's often done, as I said, more effectively, albeit within narrow bounds, within professional programs than it is in the arts and sciences. So the advantage of this scheme for thinking about liberal learning for business is that it enables us to see, to map, if you will, and to assess to what degree all three modes, plus practical reasoning, actually take place in a given program, a given course, or a whole curriculum. It also enables us to see where and how each of these modes of thinking is actually taught, since I think a moment's reflection begins to suggest that each of them requires a very distinct kind of pedagogy, a different way of engaging students and coaching students up to a fundamental standard of thinking capacity. So as embodied in the integrated programs I've just talked about at Stern School, at Indiana, and at Santa Clara, each of these modes of thinking provide the conditions for broadening the practical imagination of business students in order to explore the implications of their knowledge and the implications of their intended careers for their own lives, as well as for the larger society. They make it possible, I think, for students to see and experience something of the social impact of business. So that's really what our book is about and what it tries to set out. What I'd like to do in my remaining time is now to focus on this question of social impact and to translate a bit into what I want to call the social ecology of business, and to make a kind of speculative argument that this really needs to become a threshold concept for business education. In forming the practical imagination, questions of occupational or professional identity are closely related to the issue of the purposes a given field or industry serves. A college education in preparation for business needs to give a central place to understanding the purposes of business then, and its actual functions in complex modern societies. And it needs to do that in relation to students' developing sense of themselves and their own purposes. The modes of thinking just outlined are indispensable to this aim. That is to say that a college education as preparation for a career in business needs the robust kind of integration between liberal learning and the business disciplines embodied by the programs I've just very briefly outlined. At their core, these programs bring the perspectives of liberal learning, especially the teaching of multiple framing, reflective exploration of meaning, and practical reasoning, to bear on the central question of what business is about and how it should be conducted. They aim, that is, to focus students' analytical and imaginative powers on what we might call the social ecology of business. By ecology, I mean here an analogy to the use of the term in biology. An ecological approach describes the conditions on which the flourishing of an organism depends. And that's actually what the term was initially defined as by a German naturalist in the middle of the 19th century named Haeckel, who studied mollusks. And it was Haeckel who had this brilliant intuition that it was equally important in order to understand the structure and function of these organisms, to understand what made it possible for each of these different kinds to flourish, which then led to the idea of what we now call the ecological niche, that they are adapted to a particular environment. So the metaphor, like the term social impact, calls attention to the ways in which business organizations, the institutions of the firm and the market, must interact with the wider field of social institutions such as communities, law, and government in order to function and achieve their ends. In other words, what is the ecological niche that businesses of different kinds come to occupy and to influence and shape? These programs stand out from the great bulk of business programs because of this emphasis. But for business to play its proper role in today's complex global society, the social ecology of business needs to become central to the preparation of business personnel. Facility in understanding the social ecology of business is actually an essential capacity for contemporary business leadership. A great deal of executive MBA training really focuses on this under different language often. It is therefore an important, if often overlooked, example of what educators call a threshold concept for the academic field of business. So here then is the threshold concept idea, something that I think is a very useful one that theorists of learning have developed. They mean a way to talk about these few but essential ideas that summarize the thinking capacities which lie at the heart of an intellectual field and make it distinctive. So, for example, the idea of opportunity cost in economics. If students don't grasp that, much of economic thinking remains something they can only memorize. Right? It literally doesn't really fit together very well for them. But how, in fact, do you get students to understand opportunity cost? Typically by showing example after example. In other words, by enabling the student to think themselves into a world in which there are only, as it were, opportunity costs. So a threshold concept then is a fundamental way of understanding phenomena without which the learner cannot progress to make sense of the field as a whole. To take another example, in history, it's probably the idea of narrative, not as a simple telling of a story, but as a selective arrangement of facts and events in order to establish a rational case for an interpretation of what has happened, of building a case that this is what really was going on. This is the cause of the Civil War. This is the reason that European societies colonized outside Europe, and so on. In literature, the key theoretical threshold concept concerns how to read text critically. Again, something that literature professors spend a great deal of their time and develop a great deal of tolerance for frustration, trying to get students to understand what that means. What all these disparate examples have in common is that they are the indispensable motifs that define how people think in a given field, which separates outsiders from insiders, who, because they have crossed this conceptual threshold, hence the meaning of the use of the term, now perceive and experience phenomena in a distinctive and intellectually powerful way. But threshold concepts can also function as bottlenecks. Failure to grasp these key ways of thinking precludes gaining sophisticated understanding of the field to which they act as portals. So market-based thinking, using the threshold concept of opportunity cost, is certainly one of these that are essential for understanding and practicing the field of business. But would not the social ecology of business be another threshold concept? It certainly would if we expect business graduates to enter their occupational field with the ability to think about organizations in more than strategic terms, and to espouse a sense of responsibility for the consequences of their decisions. If so, then how might we expect it to function to improve business students' grasp of their identity and purposes of business professionals? The answer, I believe, can be found using the scheme of concepts just discussed. As I and my co-authors have noted, business students, like most majors in professional fields, tend to view their education in instrumental terms. They not only plan their course of study and weigh the value of courses by the utility these things have in getting a good first job, but as a result of learning the analytical thinking characteristic of the business disciplines, they also come to take an inside or strategic point of view when confronted with business problems and decisions. This is reinforced by some of the most effective business pedagogies, as when students learn through simulations of actual business practice or the analysis of cases. And we saw really good examples of this kind of teaching, which has big effects on students' practical imaginations. However, what business programs typically do not provide are effective ways to get a 360-degree view of these very business organizations and activities. They see them from only a single point of view. So here then is where the modes of thinking typical of liberal learning can prove their worth. Multiple framing of the situation, seeing the same business organization or situation analyzed from within, now from several outside perspectives, necessarily introduces new questions and complexities. In the best programs we visited, courses draw together concepts from the business disciplines, such as stakeholder analysis and business history, with ideas from the humanities and social and natural sciences. In well-done educational experiences, these questions posed by multiple framing can be exactly those of real business practice, which often involves the interaction between business and other institutions and groups, such as employees, lawyers, consumers, government personnel, community members, and so on. So in turn, this widening of perspective through multiple framing opens and gives urgency to the personal exploration of meaning. What is the better course of action, after all? What role can I play? What role should I play? And in things like the Stern School's capstone experience, these are exactly the questions which students practice week after week, taking on actual business cases. So the vision of practical reason then becomes essential. It is the act of contemplating courses of action within this widened horizon provided by the three modes of thinking that allows the implications of these outside perspectives to be worked through rather than simply noted and pushed aside. These outside perspectives now have to be taken inside again, have to inform and change, presumably, the way in which the strategic actor sees the environment, the way in which the strategic actor sees the ecological niche. These outside perspectives then do precisely what is needed, I think, to make a decision that does justice to the multiple issues revealed as at stake in the situation. So this is what crossing the threshold of the social ecology of business looks like as it takes place in some of the programs that we experienced. Practice in this movement, going back and forth between the inside strategic and outside ecological perspectives, is what future business leaders and entrepreneurs need if they are to be effective business professionals as well as responsible citizens. It is only possible, though, through the integration rather than the mere juxtaposition, as in the barbell idea, of the perspectives of the business disciplines and those of the liberal arts. Well done, this integration shapes a practical imagination for business that is deeper as well as wider and more likely to provide useful guidance for a student's future career than a preparation that works within a single dimension alone. As a student's comprehension of the purposes of business widen, so this new grasp of business purposes also expand and enrich the identity of developing professionals. So let me conclude, since you've been an extremely patient, kind, generous audience so far, with an example of this. And that really is occasioned by the recent biography of Steve Jobs that Walter Isaacson did that probably many of you have read, in which, unwittingly, I think Isaacson presents us with two Steve Jobs, or Steve Jobs thinking in both of these modes, not probably fully aware that these are in some contradiction with each other. And that is that a lot of the effort in the book is devoted to showing that Jobs' real genius for design arose in part because of his lifelong admiration for modernist design principles that were developed at the Bauhaus in Germany starting back in the 1920s, were then continued in various forms of design in the post-war world. And Jobs, in fact, was indifferent to market research because he knew, as a designer, capital D, very much a kind of Bauhaus way, that he understood the fundamental relations of form and function, and therefore could create products and experiences like Apple stores, which were just right. One interesting critic of Bauhaus and the modernist movements in architecture and design made the point that the real power of modernist architects, and this would include Frank Lloyd Wright as probably a good American example, but also Le Corbusier in France and Mies van der Rohe and the other Bauhaus people, was that they sold their designs, and they certainly got their high-paying clients for buildings by presenting to the client the idea that only modern man, capital M, could really appreciate and be in sync with this sort of design. That this is pure form, as it were. And the unwashed masses and the miserable bourgeoisie have to have historical dressing on things in order to appreciate them. But modern man understands pure functionality. And so therefore, you're really lucky to have me as your architect who can design for you a machine for living in which you will be modern man. The argument being that the appeal of Apple products has always been rather similar, that they flatter the consumer by giving the consumer the sense that you are really at the cutting edge of modernity now. Right? This is pure functionality, and it's beautiful. On the other hand, Isaacson gives this very interesting case of Steve Jobs as father and family man discussing what kind of washing machine should they buy. I think this is in the 90s, I think sometime, but even though things had gone bust after Steve was booted out of Apple, presumably they didn't really have to worry about the price tag. What they were worried about was how this technology would influence the values that their family, as they talked about it, had come to espouse. So questions like, how important to them was it that the washer would use only 4 quarts of water, 4 gallons of water rather than 6? How important to them was it if the washer was slower, but say produced softer fabric at the end? And so on and so forth. The interesting thing then is, in this role of consumer, Jobs had abandoned all this nonsense about perfect forms and so forth in design, and was actually fully aware that technologies embody values, and the technologies introduced into an environment change the way people act and live, and was very protective of their own family's way of living vis-a-vis emerging forms of washing technology. So whatever you think of Apple products, if you're an Apple person, you're probably ready to throw something at me at this point. If you're not, you probably don't care particularly. But what I think is worth thinking about is which of these attitudes or positions do we want to foster? And if you were to say that, well, you really do want great designers, but you also want designers who can think like Steve Jobs when worried about how the washer is going to affect their family, then the question becomes, how do you get that? What makes that, what kind of education really could make that kind of sensibility possible. And my suggestion is that an education for business that focused around this broader question of the social ecology of business would be an important kind of, to use Jobs' favorite words, an important kind of platform from which to actually launch and carry out that kind of discussion. Thank you.
I do have an iPad. I want you to see this as a sign of my sophistication and modernity. Steve Jobs understands me. I think that's important. Now, it's my privilege to be here this morning and to give you a short response to Dr. Sullivan's paper. And I want to borrow a phrase from Brother Ray. What I hope to do is begin a conversation on this important topic about business education. Sometimes the function of a respondent is to praise the speaker's insights before deftly pointing out his mistakes. As a philosopher, I'm naturally inclined to do this, but in fact there's much wisdom in Dr. Sullivan's remarks. So rather than searching out some trivial points of difference, I propose to do two things. First, to offer some supportive comments on the importance of seeing education in business as a kind of professional formation. And second, to suggest how some elements in the Catholic social tradition might inform such education. So 3 quick points about business education. First of all, I think professional management of organizations is vital to the health of society and to the welfare of individuals. To borrow a phrase from Peter Drucker, we have become a society of organizations. Organizations are so important. None of us can do what we do in a developed nation without being plugged into an organization. It's simply not possible anymore. Organizations have an impact on our lives, influence our lives in a variety of ways, probably countless ways, ways we're not even aware of consciously every day. Most of us later in the day are going to get on a little aircraft operated by an organization, and we hope that they all know what they're doing and will get us home safely. Organizations are so important that we need to have managers who not only have the proper formation to manage them well, but I think are also committed to placing the well-being of those they serve above their own. They must see and be committed to a good to be served beyond the private rewards that they might receive. Second point, I think in spite of the fact that we've focused a great deal on business education in this conference, we really ought to expand our horizons and be talking about management education. The organizations that touch our lives are not only for-profit businesses, they're also small businesses, and not only large corporations, but small businesses, nonprofits of all shapes and sizes, and agencies of government. All of these organizations need management. It's a peculiarity, I think, of business education in contrast, say, with medical education or education in engineering or in law, that we tend to think of the focus of business education to be a certain kind of organization, even though many of the same kinds of attitudes and judgments and capabilities have a very similar application in nonprofit organizations, in the church, in government agencies, and so on. So I think perhaps we ought to expand our horizons. Caritas in Veritate, Pope Benedict's last encyclical, speaks about the creation of space for other kinds of organizations, and I think this is partly what he has in mind. Third point about management education. I think it's not merely about acquiring skills, what the Greeks used to call techne, technology, technician, technical, but it's formation in a specific kind of prudence. The particular contribution of professional managers, I think, is the capacity to make sound judgments about the activities of an organization and direct them well in conditions of uncertainty. If everything is predictable, if everything is business as usual, forgive the phrase, then we don't really need professional managers. Anybody can do this, just follow the routine. But it's where things are unpredictable and uncertain that we need someone with a special kind of judgment. This isn't simply a skill. though it requires a variety of skills. It's a developed capacity to know what is genuinely good, to recognize the good as a real possibility in concrete circumstances, and to craft effective means to achieve it. I take it that when Dr. Sullivan recommends that management students study the liberal arts, he's not proposing that they simply acquire another set of skills, but rather that they cannot truly be prudent in this field if all they have is techne. The study of the liberal arts aims to illuminate the good for human persons and to enable students themselves to grow in virtue. Now let me suggest some things that the Catholic social tradition conceptually might contribute to management of education, this project of rethinking management education. This is rather an idiosyncratic list. There's a reason for it. It's not all that important. But I've got 5 things I'm going to suggest. It might have been 7, it might have been 9, it might have been 3, and certainly some of you can think of things that I've left out, but I'm the one here, so I get to offer my own thoughts about this. First of all, rethinking management education requires us to examine and question some of the deep assumptions about the human person and human welfare that underlie what we now do. If we were to do that, for instance, a different kind of session, we might think about the notion of the human person that underlies a lot of economic thinking. Human persons are atomic individuals, they're isolated individuals, they're not naturally social, they seek their own utility functions. These utility functions are idiosyncratic and self-defined, and so on and so on. These things lie behind the way in which we approach business. We need to rethink that, and I think that the Catholic social tradition provides some resources for doing that. In the end, we cannot, I think, graft a sound ethic onto a defective vision of human persons. We can't simply add ethics, for instance, to a notion of human persons that simply doesn't reflect the reality of who and what we are. For those of us in Catholic universities, it should be natural for us to align the education that we offer in management with the vision of the person and society we find in our social tradition. And I want to suggest 5 elements that we might develop. First, the profession of management is a genuine vocation. The document that Cardinal Turkson spoke to us about earlier this week, Reflection on the Vocation of the Business Person, begins with that thought. Now, when we speak about vocation in a Catholic context, we mean more than just a role to be played. Vocation for us ought to imply not only a calling, but also a caller. We discern our vocations and we accept them, but to do this we need a certain kind of humility. We're not self-created individuals. At my university, outside our School of Entrepreneurship, we have a statue of a man embedded in stone up to the knees, and he has a blindfold and a chisel in one hand and a hammer in the other, and the idea is he's kind of chiseling himself out of the stone. It reminds me of a joke about a businessman who claimed that he was a self-made man and went on about this at some length, at which point his wife turned over to a dinner companion and said, "Yes, and a more perfect example of unskilled workmanship you will never find." Recognizing what we do as a vocation requires a certain kind of humility. We ought to realize, at least out of a Catholic perspective, that to discern a vocation is to discover not only the surest path to our own fulfillment, but also a particular way in which we can contribute to the well-being of others. A vocation is never simply a private matter. It's always something social. Secondly, the dominant value which must guide us in all of this is charity, not justice. That may ring a little bit odd, but let me explain that for just a moment. We've given so much attention to justice, however we may conceive that, over the years that we've neglected the most characteristic Christian virtue, which is charity. Charity is a love of others. We see the God we love in others, and we wish those others what is best for them. Justice entails giving others what they are due. It's certainly important. can't be neglected, but it's not enough. I point out to my students that none of us really wants to live in a truly just world, because then we get what we deserve. We want to live in a merciful world in which we get something better than what we deserve. None of our students really wants the grades they have earned, right? They want something else. And that's true for all of us. Charity, in Benedict's phrase, does not merely give to others what is theirs, but it stands ready to give to others what is ours. It's the difference. Charity in organizational life, I think, provokes, charity is a theological virtue. A virtue associated with it is beneficence, which is the habit of not only wishing others well, but actively seeking the good for others where it might be possible for us to produce it. It's not just seeing others as someone, Greg, I hope you have a good life, but what can I do? What might it be possible for me to do in the concrete to enhance Greg's life? Quickly, a couple more. Authentic human dignity must be respected. This isn't new, I mean, we all know that. But to respect human dignity requires that we have an understanding of what the good for human persons is. And in the context of organizations, we do this concretely in the way in which we design work, the way in which we associate or terminate the association of persons with a community of work, the way in which we conceive of products and services, the way in which we determine our priorities. How are we going to manage this organization? What's going to be a sign of success, and so on and so on. A fourth element is solidarity. And I would say solidarity, especially in a business context, rather than conflict. Solidarity has to do with the common good. It's a virtue by which we orient our actions in support of the common good and by which we recognize our responsibilities to other persons. Solidarity seeks cooperation, even in conditions of competition. Competition doesn't necessarily mean conflict. Competition, in its best, is a mutual striving for excellence. Competition doesn't entail, and I hope we're teaching our business students this, that to be competitive in business doesn't mean aiming at putting your competitors out of business. It means seeking excellence at the highest possible level. Solidarity also seeks to establish and sustain the conditions that make it possible for every member of the community, near and far, to flourish. And one of the implications of this, Dr. Sullivan refers to it in his paper, is what we sometimes call the love of preference for the poor. The challenge for business and other organizations is to identify underserved needs, an implication of solidarity, and to devise ways to address them. The last element is stewardship. Since a calling implies a caller, I think it also implies accountability for responding to this call. We are co-creators with God, helping in the unfolding of creation. Stewardship requires that we avoid waste and destruction. It requires that we preserve and protect what is good and beautiful, but it means much more than this. As co-creators with God, we're cooperators in this unfolding of creation. We're agents of distributive justice, helping to ensure that the universal destination of the goods of creation is more than an empty phrase. We help to prepare our world for future generations. If our business education, if our education and management could reflect some of these themes, I think it might look a great deal different. Now, please understand, too, that I take it really is unsaid, but I'm going to say it anyway. This is not a substitute for developing skills. This is not either or. It's developing skills at the highest level and inculcating a set of attitudes and a set of commitments. It's not an excuse for not developing the skills in business disciplines and management disciplines. Now, these certainly are not the only elements of the Catholic social tradition that might usefully shape management education, but it's a beginning. We can have a further conversation. I want to thank Dr. Sullivan for sharing the fruits of his research and for moving our conversation forward in such productive ways, and I look forward to this conversation as it continues. Thank you.